Well, the federal budget is out in Canada, and it is a big one. Here to dissect what it is and everything that was in it, it was jam-packed, is James Marple. He is Managing Director and Senior Economist with TD Economics. James, thanks for doing this. I know you've been very busy the last little while trying to figure out everything that's going on. Can we start with the big picture? $100 billion being spent over the next 3 years, but what kind of just gives a sense of the amount of money and what kind of fiscal situation it puts Canada in to start with.
Sure. Well, we're following absolutely the biggest budget deficit, really, I think we've ever seen. $350 billion in the last fiscal year, over 16% of GDP. And now going into the next fiscal year, that's falling a bit. We'll have a deficit of $150 billion or so. Still significant, but obviously reflecting an economy that's through the worst in terms of the pandemic and not needing quite the same level of support that it did. But still looking at deficits that are just hugely a sea change from what we saw prior to the pandemic. We were looking at deficits of 20 billion or maybe 30 billion and just prior to the pandemic, and thinking these are worrisome. Well, we're way past that level now, and of course we see that in the debt to GDP ratio, which prior to the pandemic was running around the 30% mark, and we're now up around 50 and expected to head a little bit north of 50 over the next year before gradually heading lower. I mean, I think it reflects obviously just the scope of the crisis and the policy response, and in fairness, the policy response I think really helped the economy come through better than expected, and we actually have seen an economic recovery that, even according to the government's own numbers, performed better over the past year, and has come into this year performing quite a bit better, the recent variants and lockdowns notwithstanding.
It's you talk about scope, and the breadth of this budget is significant. I mean, it covers a lot of areas. There's a lot of money going to lots of different places. I want to touch on some of the key ones because I don't think we have enough time, quite frankly, to get through all of them. $30 billion being spent over 5 years for a national child care program. That was one of the big ticket items. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that in terms of the scope, I mean, the document was 750 pages. I couldn't get through all of it. I just, I had to try to skim through the biggest elements. But yes, absolutely, the headline grabbing number, and something that I think people have been looking for, government or the federal government is committed to for quite a long time, is investments in a national child care program, and I think they came, at least in terms of the numbers, 30 billion over 6 years, and a long-term commitment of 9 billion a year following that. So this is a permanent new federal spending program. It remains to be seen exactly how it will work, because of course early childhood development and education is a provincial area of jurisdiction. So they will now have to go to the provinces and offer these funds in exchange for what they hope is matching funds from the province. Their idea is that they spend 50% and the provinces spend the remainder. That will be potentially challenging in some of the more fiscally constrained provinces, but it's a big investment. It's significant in terms of the share of GDP. It's about what we've seen spent in Quebec, and Quebec really is the model here, where back in 1997 they went to a model of having affordable daycare with a goal of having less than $10. It was much less than $10 when they announced it, but a day for parents, and they really have seen the benefits of that in terms of increasing participation, especially of women in the workforce. If you look at Quebec prior to their national child care program, they had a lower rate of female participation in the labor force, and now they lead the rest of the country, and they have about half the gap among core working age people between men and women that exists in the rest of the country. So if the rest of the country can get to just where Quebec is, it means potentially up to 250,000 more women in the workforce, and that means higher potential GDP. And really, it's an investment that, yes, there are certainly some upfront costs, but it could pay for itself over the long run, both in terms of higher GDP, that means higher government revenues, but also productivity, because a lot of the research suggests that this early childhood education is really important to raising productivity and avoiding negative outcomes. Sorry if I went on a little long.
No, but it's an important one. I mean, anyone who's been working from home with also educating their kids at home can speak to that productivity piece, I think, in terms of trying to make everything work at the same time. You talk about on your note, there was a lot of major social spending in this budget. And again, we're not going to be able to get into everything, but you talk about, new funding for students, the Canada Student Grant, more funding for the Canada Workers Benefit. We've seen additional income for seniors, the OAS being increased by 10% for those over 75. How significant are each one of these, would you say?
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that this is also a budget that is likely going to be a pre-election budget, and they wanted to make sure to sprinkle some social benefits to everyone. I mean, I think in terms of the student element, it's a good idea to make post-secondary education more affordable. There was some concern about especially older participants in the OAS program, and this is universal, so they really just were throwing money at a problem. I mean, I think there's maybe some fair criticism of could they have targeted some of these things a little better, but they really wanted to I think hit every possible constituency, and they managed to do that with some pretty flashy numbers in terms of the totals that they intend to spend.
If I shift gears and think a bit more about industries, green climate commitments, the green sector, how would you characterize the budget in terms of what's being delivered there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the government had already announced so much in terms of investments in green energy. As the budget itself said, 60 billion over the past 5 years. So this maybe didn't have as much in terms of new money, but they've put, but what they have put, they've also announced a target to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions even more than they had previously envisioned. So, with everything else that they had put in place, the plan was to bring greenhouse gas emissions 30% below 2005 levels, and now they're aiming for 36%. They do that with a range of investments. There's obviously money for retrofitting, zero interest rate loans and audits for both residential and businesses I mean, that could be quite significant, especially HVAC systems are a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. So that could go a long way, but also just through this net zero accelerator, which aims to, it's sort of like a sovereign investment fund aimed at putting more toward building up capacity in the non-carbonization or decarbonization economy. So, I mean, it remains to be seen how well those funds are allocated over time, but certainly you can't doubt their commitment in terms of the numbers.
Again, I will encourage people to, I guess, crack open that 750 pages or read your report when it comes out, because there's so much in there. But the one thing that also caught my eye that you talked about in your note is that there was a lot of things happening, but there really isn't a lot to generate revenue for the government over the next little while. And I should mention, of course, that in the spending camp, they extended a lot of the pandemic benefits. They'll be scaled down a bit over time. But in terms of bringing money in, we didn't see a lot of tax changes.
Yeah, well, that makes some sense too. If you think you want to go into an election, you might not want to raise taxes too much. But there were some potentially headline-grabbing things. We did see a tax on large foreign digital service providers, and that's been something that's been long-standing, that they've maybe avoided taxation in Canada. So a 3% tax, and it is actually not huge, but it's not insignificant in terms of how much revenue it will raise. It's certainly into the billions. They also had a luxury tax, so buy your yacht, Kim, before the next little while, because it's going to be a 10% tax on yachts and personal jets and expensive vehicles. That won't raise very much at all, 500 million, I believe, over several years, but more of a signaling device that we're all in this together, perhaps, and concern about the rising inequality. And then finally, there was the tax on empty homes, vacant homes, and owned by non-residents. So aimed at going after the segment of the market where, you know, they feel could be driving up home prices and lowering affordability. That is a pretty small share of the market. They still expect to raise some revenue on it. But I mean, I think that the key, as you said, among all these things is they're more signaling than something that really changes the, you know, the overall trajectory of deficits. You know, they would have to do something much more substantial if they were going to solve or reduce deficits with the revenue side of the balance sheet.
Despite the revenue side, also again, quoting your note, you do say that the Government of Canada's 2021 budget is, I say, a historic document. Maybe tell me a bit more about why you think it is such a historic document.
Well, I mean, certainly just in terms of what we've seen, what we've come through, the amount allocated, the additional 100 billion. I mean, just fascinating in terms of the numbers. The change in the deficit over the fiscal year that just ended was 35 billion in terms of an upgrade. So the starting point was $35 billion better. That's bigger than deficits were, you know, in the decade running prior to the pandemic. So the numbers are just staggering in terms of both in, you know, just in terms of deficits and also in terms of spending. But I think, you know, the childcare commitment, I mean, you know, they've tried in the past, and this puts real dollars in front of it. And I think there's obviously quite a bit of momentum there, and hopefully that moves forward. The commitments to pivot toward longer term investments. I mean, there were a lot of other investments we didn't talk about in terms of the digital economy and trying to help businesses invest in more digital technologies, obviously also coming out of the experience of the pandemic. But just the details, even on the 100 billion over the next 3 years, I mean, that in itself is 3% of GDP. The extension of the wage supports and other supports for businesses. I mean, we've just never seen anything like this really in the recent past. And finally, you know, just getting back to a deficit that was close to, but still higher than where we were prior to the pandemic. I mean, it speaks to the ongoing challenges we will have to get back to normal coming out of this health and economic crisis.
Well, it is a historic budget for a historic time. James, thanks so much for taking us through it. We do appreciate it.
You're very welcome.